They drove me to the police station on a Tuesday morning and told me to wait in the car while they handled some paperwork. That was 3 hours ago. The officer who finally approached my window had pity in his eyes when he said, "Your family asked us to tell you they won't be coming back." I sat there in the passenger seat of my own car, watching strangers walk past, wondering how I'd become the kind of mother whose children could abandon her like a stray dog. But what they didn't know was that I'd been planning my own exit strategy. And by the time they realized what they'd done, I'd already left them something that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maxine Freeman, though everyone calls me Max, and for the past 4 years I'd been living in what I thought was a loving home with my daughter Rebecca and my son Joshua in Cedar Hills, Oregon. I raised those kids by myself after their father walked out when Rebecca was 12 and Joshua was 9. Worked double shifts at the medical supply warehouse, sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for Rebecca's college application fees, took out loans I'm still paying off to cover Joshua's community college tuition when he decided he wanted to study automotive repair. I thought I was building something solid, something that would last. I thought when they both moved back home after college that we were becoming the kind of family that sticks together through anything. Rebecca had her marketing degree but couldn't find work that paid more than minimum wage, so she moved back into her childhood bedroom with her boyfriend Marcus, who spent most of his time playing video games in my living room and eating food I bought. Joshua came back after finishing his program with debt and no immediate job prospects, bringing his girlfriend Natalie, who had opinions about everything I did wrong and wasn't shy about sharing them. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being their mother and started being their safety net, their backup plan, their convenient solution to every problem they couldn't solve on their own. I paid the mortgage, bought the groceries, covered the utilities, and somehow convinced myself that this was what family looked like. For adults sharing a 3-bedroom house, with me footing the bill and everyone else treating my generosity like it was something they'd earned just by existing. The house on Maple Street had been my pride for 15 years. I'd bought it when the kids were still young, back when I thought I'd grow old there with their father and watch grandchildren play in the backyard. It was a modest ranch-style home with a big kitchen, hardwood floors I'd refinished myself one summer, and a garden where I grew tomatoes and herbs that nobody else in the house ever seemed to notice or appreciate. The mortgage was almost paid off, just 3 more years, and I'd been looking forward to finally having something that was completely mine. But living with 4 adults who treated you like the hired help had a way of making even the most beautiful spaces feel cramped and hostile. Rebecca and Marcus had taken over the master bedroom because it was bigger and had the attached bathroom. They claimed they needed the space for Marcus's computer setup and Rebecca's work clothes, even though Rebecca worked remotely for a company that sold essential oils and Marcus was between jobs most months. I'd moved into the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to be Joshua's, with barely enough room for my bed and dresser. Joshua and Natalie had claimed the basement as their apartment, though they still came upstairs to raid my refrigerator and use my washer and dryer without asking. Natalie had strong feelings about the way I loaded the dishwasher, the brand of laundry detergent I bought, and the fact that I watched the news during dinner instead of engaging in what she called meaningful conversation. She'd grown up in a house where every meal was a family meeting, she told me repeatedly, and she found my habits antisocial and borderline dysfunctional. I started feeling like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around schedules I wasn't consulted about, buying groceries from lists other people made, and apologizing for things I'd never done wrong. When I came home from work at 6:30 every evening, tired and ready to make something simple for dinner, I'd find the kitchen full of dishes that nobody had bothered to clean, take-out containers on the counter that someone else had ordered with money they didn't have, and Marcus sitting at my kitchen table with his laptop spread across the surface like he was running a business. Rebecca would emerge from the bedroom around 7, usually in pajama pants and one of Marcus's oversized t-shirts, and announce what they'd decided to do for dinner as if I was expected to either fund it or cook it. If I suggested that maybe we could eat something from the groceries I'd bought over the weekend, she'd give me a look like I was being unreasonable and remind me that she'd had a stressful day dealing with difficult customers who didn't understand the healing power of peppermint oil. Joshua was quieter about his expectations but no less entitled. He'd appear in the kitchen while I was cooking, usually around the time everything was almost ready, and start making himself a plate without asking if there was enough for everyone. If I mentioned that I'd only made enough for myself, thinking everyone else had already eaten, he'd shrug and say he figured I always made extra. When I started making extra just to avoid the guilt, he started bringing Natalie upstairs to eat too, and then Marcus would join them, and suddenly I was cooking for 5 people every night while working full-time and paying all the bills. The breaking point should have come months earlier, but I kept making excuses. They were young, still figuring things out, still recovering from the economic uncertainty that had made finding good jobs so difficult for their generation. Rebecca's marketing degree wasn't opening the doors she'd hoped it would, and Joshua's automotive training hadn't led to the immediate employment he'd expected. These were temporary setbacks, I told myself. Soon they'd get on their feet, find better jobs, start contributing to household expenses, and maybe even show some appreciation for everything I'd been doing to keep them afloat. Instead, what happened was that they got more comfortable with the arrangement and more resentful of any suggestion that it might need to change. When I asked Rebecca if she might be able to contribute $50 a month toward groceries, she reminded me that she was barely making ends meet with her commission-based income and suggested that maybe I could buy cheaper food if money was tight. When I mentioned to Joshua that it might be time for him and Natalie to start looking for their own place, he told me that rent prices were impossible for people their age and that he'd thought I wanted them around. Marcus, who had never paid for anything in the house and never would, had somehow become the most vocal critic of my financial management. He'd lecture me about my spending habits while eating cereal I'd bought with money I'd earned, tell me I should refinance my mortgage to get better rates while contributing nothing to the payments, and suggest that I was being selfish for not taking out a home equity loan to help Rebecca start her own essential oils business. The irony was lost on all of them. Natalie appointed herself the household's relationship counselor, constantly pointing out the ways my communication style was creating tension and suggesting family meetings where we could address our issues in a healthier way. These meetings always seemed to result in me apologizing for things I didn't remember doing wrong and agreeing to accommodate everyone else's needs while my own went unmentioned. If I seemed tired or stressed, Natalie would suggest that I might benefit from therapy to work through my control issues. The worst part wasn't the money, though the financial strain was getting severe. I'd started using credit cards to cover expenses that my salary couldn't stretch to accommodate, telling myself it was temporary, that things would improve once everyone got established. The worst part was the way they'd all started looking at me like I was the problem, like my expectations were unreasonable, like my desire for basic respect and consideration was evidence of some deep character flaw. I stopped cooking elaborate meals because nobody thanked me and everyone complained about something. I stopped suggesting family activities because nobody was interested unless I was paying. I stopped asking about their days because the conversations always turned into requests for money or complaints about how hard their lives were. I started spending more time in my bedroom, reading books I checked out from the library and watching shows on my laptop with headphones so I wouldn't disturb anyone. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary started feeling like a prison where I was simultaneously the warden and the most restricted inmate. I paid for everything, cleaned up after everyone, and somehow remained the least important person in every decision that affected the space. When the air conditioning broke in July, everyone had opinions about what kind of replacement unit I should buy and how quickly I should get it installed, but nobody offered to contribute to the cost. When the dishwasher started making noise, Marcus researched new models and sent me links to the ones he thought would work best, as if his opinion carried more weight than mine in my own kitchen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I started having conversations with myself that I'd never imagined I'd need to have. How had I raised children who could live in my house, eat my food, use my utilities, and still treat me like I was the one imposing on them? How had I created a situation where asking for basic respect made me feel like I was being unreasonable? How had I become so afraid of conflict that I'd rather suffer in silence than risk the uncomfortable conversations that might lead to change? The answer was complicated and painful. I'd spent so many years trying to be the mother I'd never had, so focused on giving my children everything I'd lacked growing up, that I'd forgotten to teach them how to give back. I'd been so determined to shield them from the financial struggles I'd faced as a young single parent that I'd never shown them the real cost of the life I was providing. I'd been so committed to being supportive and understanding that I'd never set boundaries or expectations that might have prepared them to function as independent adults. Now I was paying the price for my good intentions, living in a house full of people who saw my sacrifices as their entitlements and my needs as obstacles to their comfort. And the worst part was that I'd trained them to see me this way by accepting it for so long that it had become the natural order of things. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I got up at 6, made coffee, and tried to enjoy 15 minutes of quiet before everyone else woke up and began making demands. Rebecca appeared first, padding into the kitchen in her fuzzy slippers with her hair in a messy bun, already holding her phone and frowning at something on the screen. "Mom," she said without looking up, "I need you to drive me to the police station this morning. My car won't start and Marcus has that job interview." I looked up from my coffee, confused. "The police station? What for?" She sighed heavily. Like I was being deliberately obtuse. I have to pick up that police report for the insurance claim. Remember? From when someone hit my car in the parking lot at Target. I remembered the incident from 3 weeks ago. Rebecca had come home upset because someone had backed into her car and left without leaving a note. She'd filed a police report, and her insurance company had requested a copy. What I didn't understand was why this had suddenly become urgent. On a Tuesday morning when she'd had weeks to handle it. "Can't you get it another day?" I asked. "I have to work." Rebecca looked at me like I'd suggested she set herself on fire. "Mom, the insurance company needs it by Friday or they're going to deny my claim. This is important." "Okay," I said slowly, "but why can't Marcus drive you?" "What job interview?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Some warehouse thing. He found it online yesterday. It's probably nothing, but he should try, right?" I nodded, though something felt off about the story. Marcus had been talking about job interviews regularly for months, but none of them ever seemed to materialize into actual employment. Still, I didn't want to be the reason Rebecca's insurance claim got denied, especially if someone else's carelessness had caused the damage. "What time do you need to be there?" I asked. "They open at 8. If we leave by 7:30, we should be fine." I calculated the timing in my head. If I drove Rebecca to the police station at 8 and waited for her to get the report, I could still make it to work by 9 if everything went smoothly. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. "All right," I said. "But I'll need to leave for work right after, so make sure you have everything you need." Rebecca smiled for the first time that morning. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." Something about the phrase made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the timing, the way she'd only called me the best after I'd agreed to do something that inconvenienced me for her benefit. Maybe it was the fact that she'd never called me the best when I was paying her bills or cooking her meals. Or cleaning up her messes. At 7:30, I grabbed my purse and keys while Rebecca gathered her purse and the paperwork she'd need to request the police report. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, dressed more nicely than she usually bothered with for simple errands, but I didn't think much of it. We walked out to my car, a reliable but aging Honda Civic that I'd been driving for 8 years, and I backed out of the driveway while Rebecca scrolled through her phone. The Cedar Hills Police Station was a modern brick building about 15 minutes from our house, surrounded by a parking lot that was busier than I'd expected for 8 in the morning. I found a spot near the front entrance and turned off the engine. "Do you want me to come in with you?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head quickly. "No, it's fine. It should only take a few minutes. You can just wait here." She got out of the car with her purse and paperwork, and I watched her walk toward the entrance. She moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly where she was going, which struck me as odd since she'd never been to the police station before. But people adapted quickly to new situations, I told myself. Maybe she'd called ahead to ask about the process. I settled into my seat, turned on the radio, and prepared to wait. The morning news was covering a story about proposed changes to local property taxes, something that would affect me directly as a homeowner but that my children had never shown any interest in understanding. I listened while keeping an eye on the entrance, expecting to see Rebecca emerge at any moment with her police report in hand. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I started to worry that there might be a long line or some complication with her request. I turned off the radio and checked my phone for messages, but there was nothing from Rebecca. At 45 minutes, I considered going inside to check on her, but I didn't want to seem impatient or overbearing. Maybe these things just took longer than expected. An hour passed, then an hour and 15 minutes. I was definitely going to be late for work now, and my supervisor wasn't understanding about tardiness. I tried calling Rebecca's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a text asking if everything was okay, but got no response. The parking lot had filled up with more cars, and I was starting to feel conspicuous sitting alone in my vehicle for so long. At an hour and 30 minutes, I finally got out of the car and walked toward the police station entrance. The lobby was busier than I'd expected, with several people waiting in chairs and others standing in line at what appeared to be an information desk. I looked around for Rebecca but didn't see her anywhere. I approached the information desk and waited for the officer on duty to finish with the person ahead of me. When my turn came, I explained that my daughter had come in to pick up a police report and I was wondering if there might be some delay. The officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, asked for Rebecca's name and the report number. I gave her the information I had, and she typed something into her computer, frowning slightly as she read the screen. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I show that report was picked up about an hour ago." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure? My daughter Rebecca Freeman?" She nodded. "Yes, she signed for it at 8:23. Is there a problem?" I looked around the lobby again, more frantically this time, as if Rebecca might be hiding behind a pillar or sitting in a corner I'd somehow missed. She was supposed to meet me back at the car. Did you see which direction she went when she left? The officer's expression grew more concerned. Ma'am, she left with 2 other people. A young man and a young woman. They went out the back exit toward the employee parking area. The world tilted sideways. Joshua and Natalie. They'd been here, they'd planned this, they'd taken Rebecca and left me sitting in the parking lot like an abandoned pet. The pieces started falling into place: Rebecca's nervous energy that morning, the convenient timing of Marcus's job interview, the way she'd insisted I didn't need to come inside with her. Ma'am, are you all right? The officer asked. You look pale. Would you like to sit down? I shook my head, though I felt dizzy and confused. Did they say anything when they left? My daughter, did she leave any message? The officer looked uncomfortable. She asked me to tell you that they wouldn't be coming back. I'm sorry, ma'am. I thought you knew. They wouldn't be coming back. The words echoed in my head as I stood in the lobby of the police station, surrounded by strangers conducting their business, trying to process what had just happened. My children had orchestrated an elaborate plan to abandon me in a public place, using the pretext of helping Rebecca with her insurance claim to get me away from the house and strand me somewhere I couldn't easily confront them or demand an explanation. I walked back to my car on unsteady legs, my mind racing through the implications. They'd taken my car keys. No, wait, I still had my keys. They'd left me with transportation, which meant they didn't want me completely helpless. They just wanted me gone from the house for long enough to do whatever they'd planned to do there. I sat in my car for another 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do next. I could drive home and confront them, demand an explanation, insist that we talk through whatever had motivated this cruel and bizarre behavior. I could go to work and pretend nothing had happened, deal with the situation later when I'd had time to process it. I could call the police and report something, though I wasn't sure what crime had been committed besides the breaking of my heart. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I drove to the law office of Patricia Chen, the attorney who'd helped me with my divorce 15 years ago and who'd been handling my will and other legal matters ever since. I'd been meaning to update my estate planning anyway, given how much my financial situation had changed since my children moved back home. Now seemed like the perfect time to make some adjustments that would reflect my newfound understanding of their priorities. Patricia's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, painted pale yellow with white trim and surrounded by gardens that someone clearly tended with care. I'd always felt welcome there, like I was visiting a friend rather than consulting with a professional, and Patricia herself had a way of making complicated legal matters seem manageable and straightforward. I walked into the reception area without an appointment, which was something I never would have done under normal circumstances. The receptionist, a young man with curly hair and a friendly smile, looked up from his computer when I entered. Mrs. Freeman, he said with genuine warmth. It's good to see you. Do you have an appointment with Patricia today? No, I admitted, but I was hoping she might have a few minutes to discuss some urgent changes to my will. I'm happy to wait. If she's busy. He checked the computer screen and nodded. She's got about 30 minutes between appointments. Let me see if she's available. He disappeared into the back office and returned a moment later with Patricia Chen herself, a petite woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel like she was really listening when you spoke. Max, she said, extending her hand. This is an unexpected pleasure. Come on back to my office. Patricia's office was exactly as I remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk that looked like it had been built to last centuries, and 2 comfortable chairs positioned to facilitate conversation rather than intimidation. She gestured for me to sit while she settled behind her desk with a legal pad and pen. What can I help you with today? She asked. Robert mentioned something about changes to your will. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. I need to make some significant revisions to my estate planning. Specifically, I want to remove my children as beneficiaries and establish some alternative arrangements. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. That's certainly you're right, Max. Can you tell me what's prompted this decision? It might help me understand what kind of alternative arrangements would best serve your intentions. I told her everything. The 4 years of financial support, the lack of gratitude or respect, the way my children had turned my generosity into their entitlement and my home into their personal hotel with maid service. I told her about the elaborate abandonment at the police station, the calculated cruelty of using my concern for Rebecca's insurance claim to manipulate me into the perfect position for their rejection. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, asking clarifying questions that helped me see the pattern of behavior more clearly. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. I'm sorry you're going through this, Max. It sounds incredibly painful and frustrating. From a legal standpoint, you have complete control over your estate planning, and we can absolutely make the changes you're requesting. Before we proceed, though, I want to make sure you've considered all the implications. She explained the various options available to me. I could disinherit my children completely, leaving my estate to charities or other beneficiaries. I could create a trust with specific conditions they'd need to meet to access any inheritance. I could leave them nominal amounts that would prevent them from challenging the will while directing the bulk of my assets elsewhere. There's also the option of a living trust that would allow you to maintain control of your assets while you're alive and specify exactly how they should be distributed after your death. Given what you've told me about your children's financial habits, this might prevent them from squandering their inheritance and provide some ongoing structure. I listened to all the options, but my mind kept returning to the image of Rebecca walking away from me at the police station, knowing I was sitting in that parking lot waiting for her, knowing she had no intention of coming back. The coldness required to plan and execute that kind of rejection told me everything I needed to know about how my children really saw me. I want to disinherit them completely, I said finally. I want to leave my house and savings to organizations that actually help people instead of people who just take help for granted. And I want to do it in a way that makes it very clear this was a deliberate decision based on their behavior, not some oversight or moment of anger. Patricia nodded slowly. I can draft a will that accomplishes those goals. We can include specific language explaining your reasoning, which would make it very difficult for them to challenge successfully. We should also update your financial accounts, insurance beneficiaries, and any other assets that might pass outside of the will. We spent the next hour going through the details. I chose 3 charities that I'd supported over the years, a women's shelter, a literacy program, and an organization that provided financial assistance to single parents. I also decided to leave a small amount to the police officer who'd been kind to me that morning, though Patricia explained we'd need to find a more anonymous way to do that. By the time I left Patricia's office, I had a comprehensive plan in place and appointments scheduled to finalize all the paperwork within the week. I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd finally taken action instead of just enduring whatever my children decided to do to me. When I got home that afternoon, I found exactly what I'd expected. The house was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of their belongings. Rebecca and Marcus had cleared out the master bedroom, taking everything including the furniture I'd bought and the television I'd paid for. Joshua and Natalie had emptied the basement, leaving only the fold-out couch that had been there when they moved in and some cleaning supplies I was apparently expected to use to restore the space to its original condition. They'd taken food from the kitchen, towels from the linen closet, and even the coffee maker I'd bought just 2 months ago. What they'd left behind was telling: old clothes that didn't fit, broken electronics they couldn't be bothered to repair, and a pile of bills addressed to me that they'd apparently been ignoring for weeks. On the kitchen table, weighted down with a coffee mug I didn't recognize, was a single sheet of paper with a message written in Rebecca's handwriting. Mom, we've decided we need some space to figure things out on our own. We think this is best for everyone. Don't try to contact us right now. We'll reach out when we're ready. I read the note 3 times, marveling at the selfishness embedded in every word. They'd decided. They thought it was best. They would reach out when they were ready. Even in their goodbye, there was no acknowledgement of my feelings, my needs, or my perspective on the situation they'd created. I walked through the house slowly, taking inventory of what was missing and what remained. They'd been thorough but not vindictive. They'd taken things they wanted or needed but hadn't deliberately damaged anything. The house felt larger and quieter than it had in years, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells or apologizing for existing in my own space. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at my kitchen table while watching the news on my laptop. I didn't have to worry about anyone complaining about my choice of entertainment or asking me to turn down the volume. I didn't have to save leftovers for people who might wander upstairs looking for free food. I didn't have to clean up anyone else's dishes or make space for someone else's schedule. It was the most peaceful meal I'd eaten in my own house in 4 years. Over the next few days, I started to understand what my children had really given me. They'd given me my life back. They'd freed me from the exhausting cycle of giving and accommodating and receiving nothing in return. They'd removed themselves from my daily routine so cleanly that I barely needed to adjust my habits to accommodate their absence. The financial relief was immediate and dramatic. Without 4 additional people eating my food, using my utilities, and creating expenses I was expected to cover, my budget suddenly had breathing room I'd forgotten was possible. I paid off one of my credit cards entirely and made significant payments on the others. I bought groceries for one person for the first time in years and marveled at how far my money stretched when I was only feeding myself. But the emotional relief was even more significant. I could come home from work and actually relax instead of immediately starting a second shift of cooking and cleaning and managing other people's problems. I could watch what I wanted on television, eat what I felt like eating, and go to bed when I was tired instead of staying up to accommodate everyone else's schedules. I started sleeping better, eating better, and remembering what it felt like to enjoy my own company. I read books without interruption, took long baths without worrying about using up the hot water, and played music at whatever volume I preferred. I realized I'd forgotten who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to meet other people's expectations. A week after they left, I changed all the locks on the house. Not because I was afraid they'd return to take more things, but because I wanted the security of knowing they couldn't walk back into my life as easily as they'd walked out of it. If they ever decided they wanted a relationship with me again, they'd have to knock on the door and wait for me to decide whether to let them in. 2 weeks after they left, I received a text from Rebecca. "Mom, can you send me some money? My car insurance is due and I'm short this month." I stared at the message for a long time, amazed by the audacity and the complete absence of self-awareness it represented. She'd orchestrated an elaborate plan to abandon me at a police station, disappeared from my house with her boyfriend and her belongings, left me a note demanding that I not contact her, and now she was asking for money like nothing had happened. I didn't respond to the text. I deleted it and blocked her number. 3 weeks after they left, I got a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Joshua. "Mom," he said when I answered, "we need to talk. Natalie thinks we should have a family meeting to work through some of these communication issues." The phrase, communication issues, was so perfectly Natalie that I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, they were still framing the situation as if the problem was my failure to understand their needs rather than their failure to show basic respect and consideration. "I don't think that's necessary," I said calmly. "You've made your position very clear, and I've accepted it." "What do you mean?" Joshua sounded genuinely confused, as if he couldn't imagine that his actions might have consequences. "I mean that you chose to leave, and I'm letting you stay. Gone. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." I hung up before he could respond and blocked his number too. A month after they left, I found out from a neighbor that Rebecca and Marcus were living in a studio apartment across town and that Joshua and Natalie had moved in with Natalie's parents. The neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 doors down and had always been friendly, mentioned seeing them at the grocery store and asked if I was enjoying having my house to myself again. "Oh yes," I said without hesitation. "It's been wonderful." Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "I always wondered how you managed with so many adults in one house. It must have been challenging." It occurred to me that other people had been watching the situation and drawing their own conclusions about the fairness of the arrangement. Maybe I hadn't been as good at hiding my exhaustion and frustration as I'd thought. Maybe it had been obvious to everyone except me that I was being taken advantage of. That same week, I received a call from Patricia Chen's office confirming that all the paperwork for my new will and estate planning had been finalized. My house, my savings, my life insurance, and all my other assets would now go to the charities I'd chosen rather than to the children who'd treated my generosity as their birthright. I felt no regret about the decision. If anything, I felt relieved that I'd taken control of the situation instead of continuing to enable behavior that wasn't good for any of us. My children were adults now, fully capable of supporting themselves. If they chose to do so. If they'd learned anything from our arrangement, hopefully it was that they actually could manage their own lives without my constant financial intervention. If they hadn't learned that lesson, at least I'd learned mine. I'd learned that being a good mother didn't mean being an unlimited resource for adult children who showed no appreciation or consideration in return. I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary for everyone's emotional health. And I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their dependence and force them to develop their own strength and self-sufficiency. The house on Maple Street was mine again, quiet and peaceful and organized according to my preferences rather than everyone else's demands. I was sleeping through the night, eating meals I actually enjoyed, and rediscovering hobbies I'd abandoned when my time and energy were consumed by other people's problems. For the first time in years, I was living my own life instead of funding everyone else's, and it felt like waking up from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. My children had abandoned me at a police station because they thought I was the problem in their lives, but what they'd actually done was solve the problem in mine. And tomorrow, when Patricia Chen's office sends them the notification that they've been removed from my will, they'll finally understand that actions have consequences, and that the mother they took for granted had been paying attention all along. 6 months before that Tuesday morning at the police station, I should have seen the warning signs. I should have recognized that my children weren't struggling to get on their feet, they were settling in for a permanent vacation funded by my paycheck and subsidized by my silence. But I was still operating under the delusion that this was temporary. That any day now they'd announce job offers or apartment applications or some sign that they intended to become independent adults. The first red flag came when Rebecca announced she was quitting her part-time job at the dental office because the commute was too stressful and the patients were too demanding. She'd been working there for 3 months, making just enough money to cover her car payment and phone bill, but apparently even that minimal level of responsibility had become unbearable. "I can't deal with people complaining about their teeth all day," she told me over dinner, pushing around the pasta I'd made while Marcus nodded sympathetically beside her. "It's affecting my mental health. Natalie says I should prioritize my well-being over a toxic work environment." I looked across the table at Natalie, who was cutting her food into precise small pieces and wearing the expression of someone who just delivered profound wisdom. Natalie had appointed herself the household expert on mental health, workplace dynamics, and personal boundaries, despite being unemployed herself and living in my basement rent-free. "What's toxic about it?" I asked, genuinely curious. From what Rebecca had told me, the job involved scheduling appointments, filing insurance paperwork, and occasionally helping patients feel comfortable before their procedures. It sounded like standard customer service work, the kind millions of people did every day without considering it a threat to their psychological well-being. Rebecca sighed dramatically. "Mom, you wouldn't understand. You've never had to deal with people who are in pain and taking it out on you. It's emotionally exhausting." I bit back the response that wanted to come out. I'd been dealing with people who were in pain and taking it out on me for most of my adult life, starting with her father during our marriage and continuing through years of single parenthood when she and Joshua had been the ones creating the pain. But pointing that out would make me the villain in whatever narrative they were constructing about their struggles. "So what's your plan?" I asked instead. "Are you going to look for something else right away?" Marcus spoke up before Rebecca could answer. "We think she should focus on building her essential oils business for a while. The direct sales model has incredible potential if you really commit to it. Rebecca's got natural charisma and communication skills that are perfect for that industry." I'd heard about the essential oils business, which seemed to involve Rebecca buying products from some company and then trying to convince her friends to buy them at a markup while also recruiting those friends to sell the products themselves. From what I could tell, it was less of a business and more of an elaborate pyramid scheme that required Rebecca to spend money before she could make any. "How much money has the essential oils thing made so far?" I asked. Rebecca's face flushed. "It's not about immediate profits, Mom. It's about building a customer base and developing long-term relationships. The money comes later, once you've established trust and credibility. But you need income now," I pointed out. "You still have bills to pay. That's why we're hoping you can help us out for a few more months," Marcus said, as if this was the most reasonable request in the world. "Just until Rebecca gets the business established. Think of it as an investment in her future." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a conversation about Rebecca's career plans. This was a negotiation where I was expected to fund their lifestyle while they pursued a business model that seemed designed to lose money. And somehow they'd framed it as helping Rebecca achieve her dreams rather than enabling two adults to avoid the reality of employment. "I'm not in a position to support everyone indefinitely," I said carefully. "My income covers the household expenses, but it doesn't stretch to cover everyone's personal bills too." Natalie looked up from her carefully arranged plate. "Max, I think you're looking at this from a scarcity mindset instead of an abundance mindset. When we support each other's growth and success, everyone benefits. Rebecca's business could eventually contribute significantly to the household income." I stared at her, amazed by the audacity of someone who'd never contributed a single dollar to my household expenses lecturing me about abundance mindsets. Natalie had a way of speaking that made her opinions sound like established facts, using therapy language and business buzzwords to disguise what were essentially demands that I continue funding her boyfriend's sister's fantasy of becoming an entrepreneur. "I have an abundance mindset about a lot of things," I said slowly. "But I also have a realistic understanding of my bank account. I can't create money that doesn't exist." Joshua, who'd been quiet through most of this conversation, suddenly joined in. "Mom, we're not asking you to create money. We're just asking you to be flexible while we figure things out. Nobody expected the job market to be this difficult for our generation." The job market excuse was one I'd been hearing for months, usually delivered with the implication that their unemployment was a societal problem rather than a personal choice. But I'd been watching the help wanted signs at businesses around town, reading job postings online, and talking to other parents whose children had managed to find work despite the supposedly impossible conditions. "There are jobs available," I said. Maybe not perfect jobs, maybe not dream jobs, but jobs that pay money and provide experience. The grocery store is hiring, the hardware store needs weekend help, the hospital is always looking for people in housekeeping and food service. Rebecca made a face like I'd suggested she apply to work in a sewage treatment plant. Mom, those aren't career positions. Those are just random jobs that don't use any of my skills or education. Sometimes you take random jobs to pay your bills while you look for career positions, I said. That's what adults do. The silence that followed was thick with resentment. I could see Marcus and Rebecca exchanging glances, and Natalie had set down her fork like she was preparing to deliver another lecture about my attitude problem. Joshua was staring at his plate like he was hoping to disappear into it. I think maybe we should talk about this more when everyone's feeling less defensive, Natalie said finally, using the tone of voice people use with unreasonable children. There's clearly some communication breakdown happening here. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. The communication breakdown was that 4 adults were living in my house, eating my food, using my utilities, and contributing nothing while lecturing me about my mindset and my attitude when I suggested they might want to consider employment. But I didn't say that. I just nodded and started clearing the dishes, letting them interpret my silence however they wanted. I'd learned that arguing with them was pointless. They'd already decided that I was the problem, that my expectations were unreasonable, and that any resistance I offered to their plans was evidence of my failure to understand their unique challenges. Rebecca hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed me 3 apartment listings. The first was a 1-bedroom in a newly renovated complex with a gym and a pool. The second was a 2-bedroom townhouse with a garage and a small yard. The third was a studio in what appeared to be a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. All 3 were priced well above what I would have expected for young adults with minimal income and no established rental history. These weren't starter apartments for people trying to become independent. These were lifestyle choices for people who expected someone else to subsidize their preferences. These are all pretty expensive, I said diplomatically. Have you looked at anything more affordable? More affordable means sketchy neighborhoods and cockroaches, Marcus said dismissively. We're not going to live somewhere unsafe just to save a few $100s a month. A few $100s a month was a significant amount of money, especially for people who weren't earning any money. But somehow they'd convinced themselves that their housing preferences were non-negotiable necessities rather than luxury choices they wanted me to finance. I handed the phone back to Rebecca. I need to think about this. It's a big decision, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications. The disappointment on their faces was immediate and dramatic. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus put his arm around her like I'd just delivered devastating news rather than asked for time to consider a major financial commitment. I guess we'll have to cancel the appointments, Rebecca said sadly. By the time you decide, these places will be gone. The guilt trip was so transparent that it was almost insulting. They'd created an artificial timeline, scheduled appointments without confirming they had the money, and now they were trying to make me feel responsible for their disappointment when I didn't immediately agree to fund their housing choices. You can still go look at them, I said. It's good to see what's available and get a sense of the market. But I'm not ready to commit to such a large expense without more time to think it through. They left that afternoon with less enthusiasm than they'd shown that morning, and when they returned that evening, their mood had soured considerably. Rebecca went straight to the bedroom without telling me about the apartments, and Marcus settled in front of the television with the kind of sullen energy that suggested the day hadn't gone as planned. I didn't ask how the apartment visits had gone. I had a feeling I already knew. Over the next few weeks, the apartment search seemed to lose momentum. Rebecca stopped mentioning specific listings or scheduling appointments, and Marcus returned to spending his days in front of his computer, presumably looking for work but apparently not finding any. The breakfast spread and the optimistic talk about building their own life together were replaced by a return to the previous pattern of sleeping late, eating my food, and treating my house like a free hotel. I started to understand that the apartment search had been a performance, a way to demonstrate that they were trying to become independent while simultaneously proving that independence was impossible without my financial support. They'd shown me apartments they knew I wouldn't want to pay for, created a timeline they knew I couldn't meet, and then used my hesitation as evidence that I was preventing them from moving forward with their lives. It was a masterfully constructed manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for not immediately funding their lifestyle preferences while also establishing that their continued presence in my house was my choice rather than their failure to launch. If I wanted them gone, the logic went, I could pay to make it happen. If I didn't want to pay, then I had no right to complain about them staying. Joshua and Natalie seemed to be watching this whole apartment drama with interest, like they were taking notes for their own future manipulations. Natalie started making comments about how expensive housing had become and how difficult it was for young people to afford independent living. Joshua mentioned casually that he and Natalie were thinking about looking for their own place too, but that they'd probably need to save up for quite a while to afford the deposits and moving expenses. The message was clear. If I wanted my house back, if I wanted my children to become independent adults, I was going to have to pay for the privilege. They'd turned my desire for them to succeed into a financial obligation, and they'd structured the situation so that saying no to their requests meant accepting their permanent presence in my home. It was a brilliant strategy, and it might have worked if I hadn't started to recognize it for what it was. But once I saw the pattern, once I understood that every conversation about their future was really a negotiation about my money, everything changed. I stopped asking about job applications and apartment searches. I stopped offering advice about career planning and financial management. I stopped engaging with their hints about needing help with deposits and moving expenses. Instead, I started planning my own future, the one where I reclaimed my house and my life and my bank account from people who'd turned my love into their leverage. That's when I started thinking seriously about the will, about estate planning, about making sure that my lifetime of work and sacrifice wouldn't be treated as casually as my daily generosity had been. If my children saw me as nothing more than a source of funding for their lifestyle choices, then maybe it was time to redirect that funding toward people and organizations that would actually appreciate it. The thought was liberating and terrifying. At the same time, for so many years, everything I'd done had been motivated by wanting to provide for my children, wanting to give them opportunities and security and support. The idea of deliberately excluding them from my estate felt like betraying everything I'd believed about motherhood and family loyalty. But as I watched them manipulate me day after day, as I listened to them frame their demands as my obligations and their failures as my problems, I started to understand that I'd already been betrayed. They'd taken my love and turned it into their entitlement. They'd taken my support and turned it into their expectation. They'd taken my home and turned it into their free housing at my expense. If they could redefine our relationship so completely, then maybe I could redefine it too. Maybe I could stop being the mother who gave everything and became the woman who protected herself. Maybe I could stop funding their immaturity and start investing in my own future. The decision was still forming in my mind when the morning of the police station abandonment arrived. I hadn't acted on it yet, hadn't made any concrete changes to my legal documents or financial arrangements. I was still in the thinking stage, still weighing options and considering consequences. But when Rebecca asked me to drive her to get that police report, when she orchestrated that elaborate abandonment, when she left me sitting in that parking lot like discarded furniture, she made the decision for me. She showed me exactly how much I meant to her, exactly how little she valued everything I'd given her, exactly how easily she could discard me when it served her purposes. And in that moment, sitting in my car outside the police station, I realized I wasn't angry or hurt or confused anymore. I was free. Free to stop pretending that our relationship was something other than what it had become. Free to stop funding people who saw me as an ATM with inconvenient emotions attached. Free to start living for myself instead of for people who'd forgotten I was a person rather than just a resource. The apartment search, the job market excuses, the mental health justifications, the abundance mindset lectures, all of it had been preparation for this moment. They'd been training me to accept that my role in their lives was to solve their problems and fund their choices while expecting nothing in return. They'd been conditioning me to believe that wanting respect or appreciation or basic consideration made me selfish and unreasonable. But sitting in that parking lot, I finally understood that the only selfish and unreasonable people in this situation were the ones who'd abandoned their mother at a police station after years of living off her generosity. And once I understood that, everything else became clear. They thought they were punishing me by leaving. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about what happened when I didn't meet their expectations. What they'd actually done was give me permission to stop meeting those expectations forever. And tomorrow, when they found out about the will, they'd understand that some lessons work both ways. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd left Patricia Chen's office with my new estate planning documents finalized and notarized. I was drinking my second cup of coffee in the blessed quiet of my empty kitchen when I heard the mail truck pull away from the curb. Through the window, I could see the mail carrier walking back to his vehicle, and something about his posture suggested he delivered more than just the usual bills and advertisements. I walked out to the mailbox wearing my robe and slippers, not caring if the neighbors saw me in my morning attire. One of the benefits of living alone again was that I didn't have to worry about anyone commenting on my appearance or suggesting that I should get dressed before stepping outside for 30 seconds to collect my mail. Mixed in with the electric bill and a grocery store circular was a thick cream-colored envelope addressed to me in Patricia's precise handwriting. I recognized it immediately as the copies of all the legal documents we'd prepared, the ones I'd requested so I could review everything one final time before the official notifications were sent to the affected parties. I took the mail back inside and spread everything out on my kitchen table, the same table where Rebecca had left her goodbye note just weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now using that space to review documents that would ensure she'd never benefit from abandoning me again. The will was comprehensive and clearly written, with language that Patricia had assured me would make it nearly impossible to challenge successfully. It specifically stated that I was of sound mind and body when making these decisions, that I'd carefully considered the implications of my choices, and that the distribution of my assets reflected my deliberate assessment of the recipient's character and behavior. The house on Maple Street, which I'd bought with my own money and maintained with my own labor and protected with my own sacrifices, would go to the women's shelter where I'd volunteered during Rebecca's high school years. The organization provided emergency housing and support services to women escaping domestic violence, and I knew they'd either use the property for additional housing or sell it to fund their programs. My savings account, which had taken me 20 years to build and which had been steadily depleted by my children's expenses over the past 4 years, would be divided between the literacy program that had taught adult learners in our community and the organization that provided financial assistance to single parents. Both groups understood the value of money because they'd seen what happened when people didn't have it. My life insurance policy, which I'd maintained for decades believing it would provide security for my children after I was gone, would now benefit the local food bank that fed families who couldn't afford groceries rather than adults who could work but chose not to. Even my personal possessions had been allocated thoughtfully. My books would go to the library, my clothes to the homeless shelter, my jewelry to be sold with the proceeds supporting literacy programs. I'd left specific instructions that nothing of value should end up in a landfill or storage unit where it would benefit no one. The only items I designated for my children were their own baby books and childhood photographs, along with a letter explaining my decisions. Patricia had suggested including something personal to demonstrate that this wasn't an oversight or a moment of anger, but a deliberate choice made by someone who remembered them as children while acknowledging what they'd become as adults. Reading through everything again, I felt the same sense of relief and empowerment I'd experienced in Patricia's office. These documents represented the first time in years that I'd made decisions based on my own values and priorities rather than other people's expectations and demands. I was finally using my resources to support people and causes I believed in rather than enabling behavior I found destructive and ungrateful. The official notifications would go out the following week. Patricia had explained. Rebecca and Joshua would receive certified letters informing them that they'd been removed as beneficiaries from my will and estate planning. The letters would include copies of the relevant documents and contact information for Patricia's office, in case they had questions or wanted to contest the decisions. I wasn't required to notify them personally, Patricia had made clear. These were legal documents, not family discussions, and I had no obligation to justify my choices or negotiate my decisions. But I'd asked her to include a personal letter with each notification, something that would help them understand that this wasn't a punishment but a natural consequence of their own behavior. I spent that morning writing those letters, trying to find words that were honest without being cruel, clear without being defensive. I wanted them to understand that I'd watched them carefully over the years, that I'd seen who they'd become when they thought their inheritance was guaranteed, and that I'd made my decisions accordingly. The letter to Rebecca was the hardest to write. She'd been my firstborn, the child I'd rocked to sleep during those exhausting early years of single motherhood, the little girl who'd helped me plant flowers in the front yard and stood on a step stool to help me cook dinner. Somewhere inside the entitled young woman who'd abandoned me at a police station was the daughter I'd loved unconditionally for 26 years. But love, I'd learned, couldn't survive indefinitely without respect, consideration, or basic human decency in return. I'd given Rebecca everything I could give, and she'd responded by treating my generosity as her birthright and my boundaries as obstacles to overcome. If she could walk away from me so easily, then maybe it was time for me to walk away from her too. The letter to Joshua was shorter but no less painful. He'd been my baby, the child who'd clung to my leg during thunderstorms and fallen asleep in my arms while I read him bedtime stories. The next morning, I woke up to find Rebecca in the kitchen making what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast spread. There were eggs Benedict, fresh fruit salad, coffee cake that looked store-bought but expensive, and orange juice that I knew I hadn't purchased. She was humming while she worked, wearing a sundress I'd never seen before and makeup that suggested she was planning to go somewhere special. "What's the occasion?" I asked, pouring myself coffee from the pot she'd made. "Marcus is taking me to look at apartments today," she said brightly. "We figured it's time to start getting serious about finding our own place." Relief flooded through me so quickly that I almost laughed out loud. That's wonderful, Rebecca. I'm so glad you're ready to take that step. She beamed at me like she was delivering the best news in the world. We've been talking about it for weeks. Marcus found some really cute places online, and we have appointments to see 3 of them. This afternoon. I tried to contain my excitement, but the prospect of having my house back, of returning to a manageable budget, of not having to navigate around other people's schedules and opinions every day, was almost overwhelming. I started calculating how much money I'd save on groceries alone, how much space I'd have once they moved their belongings out of my bedroom, how quiet and peaceful my evenings would become. Do you have first month's rent saved up? I asked, trying to sound supportive rather than eager. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. Well, that's the thing. Most places want first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. It's like $3,000 up front, which is more than we have right now. My heart sank. Of course there was a catch. Of course the solution to my problem came with a price tag that I'd be expected to pay. But we figured, she continued quickly, that you might be willing to help us with the deposit. As a loan, obviously. We'd pay you back once we get settled and Marcus finds work. Marcus appeared in the kitchen at that moment, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt like he was going to a job interview rather than apartment hunting. He looked more put together than I'd seen him in months, and for a moment I wondered if this apartment search was really just another performance designed to extract money from me. Morning, Mrs. Freeman, he said with unusual politeness. Rebecca told you about our apartment plans? She did, I said carefully. It sounds like you've got a busy day ahead of you. We're really excited, he said, helping himself to the breakfast Rebecca had prepared. It's time for us to start building our own life together. We just need a little help getting started. The phrase, a little help, was doing a lot of work. In that sentence, $3,000 wasn't a little help. It was a significant amount of money that would stretch my already tight budget and create financial stress for months to come. And the promise to pay it back was meaningless coming from 2 people who'd never successfully paid for anything on their own. I'll have to think about it, I said. That's a lot of money, and I'd need to see how it fits into my budget. Rebecca's face fell. Mom, we can't put down a deposit without the money. These apartments won't wait around while we save up. If we don't move fast, we'll lose the opportunity. The artificial urgency was a familiar tactic. Every request for money came with some deadline or emergency that made it impossible for me to consider the decision carefully. Every expense they wanted me to cover was presented as time-sensitive and irreplaceable, as if saying no would destroy their chances forever. Then maybe you should look at cheaper places, I suggested. Apartments that don't require such a large upfront payment. Marcus and Rebecca exchanged another one of their looks, the kind that suggested I was being unreasonable by not immediately agreeing to fund their housing preferences. Mom, Rebecca said with exaggerated patience, cheap apartments are in bad neighborhoods or in terrible condition. We're not asking you to pay for a luxury place. These are just normal, safe apartments that cost what apartments cost. I'd been looking at rental listings myself lately, partly out of curiosity and partly because I'd started fantasizing about what it might be like to live alone again. I knew what apartments cost in our area, and I also knew there were options available for significantly less than what Rebecca and Marcus were apparently considering. Let me see the listings, I said. I'd like to understand what we're talking about. He'd been quieter than Rebecca, more sensitive, and I'd always hoped that meant he had more empathy and consideration for other people's feelings. Instead, his sensitivity had made him easier to manipulate, first by his father and later by Rebecca and Natalie. He'd learned to avoid conflict by staying silent when he should have spoken up, by going along with plans he didn't agree with, by letting other people make decisions that affected everyone around them. His silence during the police station abandonment had been just as hurtful as Rebecca's active participation. Both letters ended the same way, with an explanation of what I hoped they'd learn from this experience and an invitation to contact me if they ever wanted to rebuild our relationship. On terms that included mutual respect and consideration. I wasn't cutting them out of my life forever, I explained, but I was no longer willing to fund their lifestyle choices or tolerate their emotional manipulation. If they wanted a relationship with me, they'd need to start treating me like a person whose feelings mattered rather than a resource whose only value was financial. If they could learn to do that, then maybe we could find a way forward together. If they couldn't, then at least I'd have the satisfaction of knowing my life's work would benefit people who understood its value. I sealed both letters in envelopes and walked them to Patricia's office that afternoon, where her assistant confirmed they'd be included with the official notifications the following week. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd finally stopped carrying weight that had never been mine to carry in the first place. That weekend, I started making other changes to my living situation that reflected my new reality as a woman living alone by choice rather than by abandonment. I moved my belongings back into the master bedroom, claiming the space that was rightfully mine and setting it up according to my preferences rather than accommodating other people's needs. I bought new bedding in colors I actually liked, hung artwork that appealed to me rather than maintaining neutral choices that wouldn't offend anyone, and rearranged the furniture to create a reading nook by the window where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the birds in my backyard. For the first time in years, my bedroom felt like a sanctuary rather than a temporary refuge. I reclaimed the basement too, transforming it from Joshua and Natalie's makeshift apartment back into the workshop and storage space I'd originally intended. I set up my sewing machine in one corner, organized my gardening supplies along one wall, and created a small exercise area where I could work out without worrying about disturbing anyone or being disturbed. The kitchen became my favorite room again once I removed all traces of other people's preferences and habits. I restocked the pantry with foods I actually enjoyed eating, replaced the mismatched dishes and utensils with a coherent set that pleased me, and started cooking meals that reflected my tastes rather than trying to accommodate everyone else's dietary restrictions and preferences. I even bought myself fresh flowers for the kitchen table, something I'd always wanted to do but had avoided because someone in the house invariably complained about the expense or the fragrance or the space the arrangement took up. Now I could fill my home with flowers every week if I wanted to, and nobody had the right to object or suggest I was being wasteful. The financial relief of living alone was even more dramatic than I'd expected. My grocery bills dropped by more than half, my utility costs decreased significantly, and I no longer had to budget for other people's emergencies or unexpected expenses. For the first time in years, I had money left over at the end of each month. Money I could save or spend on things that brought me joy rather than obligations I resented. I started taking myself out to dinner occasionally, something I'd never done when I was supporting 4 other adults who would have seen my restaurant visits as evidence that I had extra money I should be sharing with them. I bought books without guilt, replaced worn-out clothing without agonizing over the expense, and scheduled dental cleanings and eye exams I'd been postponing to save money for other people's priorities. The psychological relief was even more significant. I could come home from work and actually relax instead of immediately starting a second shift of cooking and cleaning and managing other people's problems. I could make plans for my evenings and weekends without checking with anyone else or accommodating anyone else's schedule. I could watch what I wanted on television, play music at whatever volume I preferred, and go to bed when I was tired rather than staying awake to avoid missing some family drama that required my intervention. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years, no longer jolted awake by footsteps in the hallway or voices in the kitchen or the sound of someone leaving or returning at odd hours. I woke up rested and peaceful, ready to start my day rather than dreading whatever crisis or demand might be waiting for me in the kitchen. But the most surprising change was how much I started enjoying my own company. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alone with my thoughts without someone interrupting to ask for money or attention or solutions to problems they'd created for themselves. I rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned, books I'd stopped reading, and interests I'd pushed aside to make room for other people's priorities. I started gardening again, spending my weekend mornings planting vegetables and flowers that I could tend without anyone complaining about the time I spent outside or the dirt I tracked into the house. I took up knitting again, a hobby I'd loved in my 30s but had stopped when my children decided my craft supplies were taking up too much space in the living room. I even started dating, something I hadn't done since my divorce 15 years earlier. I joined an online dating site for people over 40 and went on coffee dates with men who had grown children and understood the challenges of parenting adults who struggled with independence. It was refreshing to talk to people who weren't asking me for money or expecting me to solve their problems. Most of these dates didn't lead to anything serious, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I was finally living like a woman, with her own interests and desires rather than a support system whose only purpose was enabling other people's choices. I was rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly accommodating other people's needs and wants and expectations. 3 weeks after Patricia's office sent the notifications, my phone started ringing. The first call came from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Rebecca calling from someone else's phone after discovering I'd blocked her usual number. I let it go to voicemail and listened to the message while I was making dinner. For myself, something simple and satisfying that I could eat while reading a book without anyone commenting on my antisocial behavior. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Rebecca's voice said, tight with anger and disbelief, "but I got some crazy letter from your lawyer saying you changed your will. This is insane. You can't just disinherit your own children because you're mad about some stupid misunderstanding. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about this." The assumption that this was a game, a temporary tantrum that could be resolved through negotiation, was so perfectly Rebecca that I almost laughed. Even when presented with legal documents and official notifications, she couldn't imagine that her actions might have permanent consequences. In her mind, I was probably just trying to get her attention or teach her a lesson, and if she applied the right pressure or found the right arguments, she could convince me to change my mind. The second call came 2 hours later, this time from Joshua using Natalie's phone. His message was longer and more emotional, with the shaky quality of someone who was genuinely upset rather than just angry. "Mom, what's going on? Natalie showed me the letter Rebecca forwarded, and I don't understand what's happening. The lawyer said you changed your will because of our behavior, but I don't know what we did wrong. I know you were upset about us moving out, but we thought you wanted more space. Can you please call me back so we can talk? I miss you, and I don't want our family to fall apart over some misunderstanding." The genuine confusion in Joshua's voice was almost heartbreaking. He really didn't understand what they'd done wrong. Which meant he'd never recognized the abandonment at the police station as cruel or the years of financial exploitation as unfair. In his mind, they'd been struggling young adults who'd needed help, and I'd been a mother who'd provided that help. Because that's what mothers do. He couldn't see that struggling and needing help didn't give them the right to treat me like a servant in my own home or disappear from my life without explanation when it suited their purposes. He couldn't understand that being family didn't exempt them from basic courtesy and consideration. He couldn't recognize that taking advantage of someone's love and generosity eventually destroys both the love and the generosity. The third call came the next morning from Marcus, of all people, using Rebecca's phone to try a different approach. His message was a masterpiece of manipulation, delivered in the reasonable tone of someone trying to mediate a family dispute. "Mrs. Freeman, this is Marcus. Rebecca's really upset about this whole situation, and I thought maybe I could help clear up whatever miscommunication is happening here. I know Rebecca loves you and misses you, and I think there's probably just some hurt feelings on both sides that need to be worked through. Maybe we could all sit down together and talk about what's bothering everyone? I really think this can be resolved if everyone's willing to listen to each other." The audacity of Marcus positioning himself as a family mediator was stunning. This was someone who'd lived in my house for months without contributing a single dollar to household expenses, someone who'd eaten my food and used my utilities while lecturing me about my spending habits, someone who'd participated in the elaborate plan to abandon me at a police station. Now he wanted to facilitate a family meeting where we could all share our feelings and find a way forward together. I deleted all 3 messages without responding and blocked the new numbers they'd used to contact me. If they wanted to communicate with me, they could write letters or send emails. I was done with phone calls that allowed them to control the conversation and pressure me for immediate responses to demands disguised as requests for dialogue. The attempts to contact me escalated. Over the following week, Rebecca left flowers on my doorstep with a note asking me to call her. Joshua sent a card through the mail with a long handwritten message about how much he missed our relationship and how sorry he was for whatever he'd done to hurt me. Natalie somehow got my work email address and sent me a message about the importance of family forgiveness and healing generational trauma. Even Marcus tried sending me a LinkedIn message, as if professional networking etiquette might succeed where personal appeals had failed. His message was full of business jargon about stakeholder alignment and win-win solutions, treating our family conflict like a corporate dispute that could be resolved through better project management. None of these communications acknowledged what they'd actually done wrong. None of them included apologies for specific behaviors or promises to change particular patterns. They were all variations on the same theme, that I was overreacting to some unnamed offense and that we should all sit down together to work through our communication issues. They still couldn't see that the problem wasn't communication. The problem was that they'd treated me like an ATM with inconvenient emotions attached, and when I'd stopped functioning as their personal bank, they'd discarded me like a broken appliance. The problem was that they'd spent years taking my love and support for granted while contributing nothing but criticism and demands in return. The problem was that they'd proven, through their actions rather than their words, that they saw me as valuable only for what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. And no amount of family meetings or healing conversations could undo that fundamental lack of respect and consideration. But the real breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, knocked on my door with information that changed everything I thought I understood about the morning at the police station. "Max," she said when I opened the door, "I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I've been thinking about something ever since I saw Rebecca and that boyfriend of hers moving boxes out of your house a few weeks ago." I invited her in for coffee, curious about what she might have observed from her house 2 doors down. Mrs. Patterson was retired and spent a lot of time gardening in her front yard, which gave her a clear view of the comings and goings on our street. She'd always been friendly but respectful, someone who would wave and chat about the weather but never pried into personal business. The thing is, she continued, once we were settled at my kitchen table, I saw them loading up a moving truck the morning you left with Rebecca. But it wasn't just their stuff they were moving. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't sure she should be sharing this information but felt obligated to do so. I saw them taking furniture that I remembered from when you invited me over for coffee last year. That nice dining room set, some of the living room furniture, boxes and boxes of things that didn't look like young people's belongings. The coffee I'd been drinking turned bitter in my mouth. Are you sure? She nodded reluctantly. I almost came over to ask if everything was all right, but then I thought maybe you'd given them permission to take those things. But when I saw you coming home alone that evening and they were already gone, I started wondering if maybe they'd taken advantage of you being away from the house. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. The police station hadn't been just about getting rid of me. It had been about getting me out of the house long enough for them to take whatever they wanted without having to ask permission or face objections. They'd planned not just to abandon me, but to rob me. In the process, I thought about the empty spaces I'd noticed when I came home that day, the missing items I'd attributed to their normal belongings. The good dishes I'd inherited from my mother, the small television from the living room, the antique lamp that had belonged to my grandmother. I'd been so focused on their emotional betrayal that I hadn't fully catalogued what they'd taken with them. Mrs. Patterson, I said slowly, would you be willing to write down what you saw? With dates and times if you remember them? She nodded immediately. Of course. I actually wrote some notes in my garden journal that morning because I was trying to figure out what was happening. I can get those for you right now if you'd like. She returned 20 minutes later with 3 pages of handwritten notes describing what she'd observed on the morning they left. The timeline was damning. Rebecca and I had left for the police station at 7:30. By 8:15, a rental truck had pulled into my driveway. By 10:30, Joshua, Natalie, and Marcus had loaded it with what Mrs. Patterson estimated was a household's worth of furniture and belongings. By 11, they were gone. They'd abandoned me at the police station not just to hurt me emotionally, but to give themselves a clear window to take whatever they wanted from my house without having to justify their choices or negotiate about what belonged to them versus what belonged to me. The whole thing had been a carefully orchestrated theft disguised as family drama. I called Patricia Chen's office that afternoon and made an appointment to discuss my legal options. When I explained what Mrs. Patterson had witnessed, Patricia's expression grew grim. This could be considered theft, she said bluntly. Taking someone else's property without permission, even family members taking from other family members, can be prosecuted as a crime, especially if the items have significant value. I provided her with a list of everything I could remember being missing, along with approximate values based on what I'd paid for the items or what similar pieces might cost to replace. The total was over $8,000, enough to qualify as a felony in our state. What do you want to do about this? Patricia asked. You could file a police report and pursue criminal charges. You could demand the return of the property through civil court. Or you could document everything carefully and use it as additional justification for your estate planning decisions if they try to challenge the will. I thought about it for several days, weighing the satisfaction of seeing them face legal consequences against the emotional cost of pursuing charges against my own children. In the end, I decided on a fourth option that Patricia hadn't mentioned. I would give them one chance to return what they'd taken voluntarily. If they refused or ignored my request, then I would pursue every legal remedy available to me, and they would learn that stealing from me had consequences just as permanent as abandoning me. I wrote one final letter to each of them, explaining what Mrs. Patterson had witnessed and what I discovered was missing from my house. I gave them 30 days to return everything they'd taken without permission, along with written apologies acknowledging what they'd done. If they met those conditions, I wrote, I would consider rebuilding our relationship on terms that included mutual respect and consideration. If they didn't, they would hear from me next through my attorney and the police department, and they would discover that their inheritance wasn't the only thing they'd lost when they decided to treat me like someone whose feelings and property didn't matter. I mailed the letters on a Friday afternoon and spent the weekend feeling like I'd finally taken control of a situation that had been controlling me for far too long. Whatever happened next, I was no longer the victim of their choices. I was a woman who had options and resources and the determination to use both. Monday morning, the phone started ringing again. But this time, I was ready for them. The first call came at 6:30 Monday morning, before I'd even finished my coffee. I recognized Rebecca's number, the original one I'd blocked weeks ago, which meant she'd managed to get it unblocked somehow or was calling from a different device. I let it ring through to voicemail while I buttered my toast and tried to mentally prepare for whatever drama was about to unfold. The message was exactly what I'd expected. Rebecca's voice was shrill with indignation and disbelief, the tone of someone who couldn't comprehend that their actions might have consequences they didn't like. "Mom, I cannot believe you're accusing us of stealing from you. We lived in that house for years. Half that stuff was ours anyway, or things you said we could have when we moved out. You're making us sound like criminals when we're your own children. This is absolutely insane, and I'm not going to stand for these accusations. Call me back right now so we can straighten this out." The assumption that she could demand immediate communication after weeks of being blocked, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that taking someone else's property without permission might be wrong, the reframing of theft as a misunderstanding about ownership, it was all so perfectly Rebecca that I felt a strange sense of validation. This was exactly the response I'd predicted, and it confirmed that my decision to pursue legal action was justified. The second call came 20 minutes later, this time from Joshua. His message was longer and more defensive, with the wounded tone of someone who genuinely believed he was being treated unfairly. "Mom, I got your letter about the missing things, and I'm really confused about what you think happened. We took some furniture and stuff when we moved out, but we thought that was okay. You never said we couldn't take anything, and some of those things have been in our rooms for years. I don't understand why you're calling it stealing when we're family. Can we please talk about this like adults? I feel like there's been some huge misunderstanding that's spiraling out of control." The hurt bewilderment in Joshua's voice was almost convincing, except for the glaring omission of any mention of the police station abandonment or the coordinated timing of their departure. He was focusing entirely on the property issue while ignoring the context that made their actions theft rather than a family misunderstanding about belongings. Marcus called next, using a different phone number and adopting the reasonable tone of someone trying to mediate a dispute between unreasonable parties. His message was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as conflict resolution. "Mrs. Freeman, I think there's been a serious miscommunication here that's causing a lot of unnecessary stress for everyone involved. From our perspective, when families live together for extended periods, there's naturally some blending of belongings and shared ownership of household items. We certainly never intended to take anything that wasn't ours, and if there's been some confusion about what belongs to whom, I'm sure we can work that out through honest dialogue. Maybe we could arrange a time to sit down together and go through everything item by item? I really believe this can be resolved if everyone approaches it with good faith and open communication." The corporate speak, the assumption that this was about miscommunication rather than deliberate action, the suggestion that we could resolve theft through dialogue, it was all designed to make me feel like I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. But I'd learned to recognize Marcus's manipulation tactics, and I wasn't falling for them anymore. The calls continued throughout the morning, each one following the same pattern: denial, deflection, reframing, and demands for immediate communication. To resolve what they insisted was a misunderstanding. None of them acknowledged the police station abandonment. None of them apologized for taking my property without permission. None of them seemed to grasp that their behavior had damaged our relationship beyond the point where family meetings and honest dialogue could fix everything. By lunchtime, I'd received 7 voicemails, 3 text messages, and 2 emails, all variations on the same themes. I was overreacting, they were being unfairly accused, this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. The desperation behind the constant contact was obvious, but so was the continued refusal to take responsibility for their actions. I didn't respond to any of it. I'd given them clear instructions in my letters about what needed to happen for us to rebuild our relationship, and until they were ready to meet those conditions, I had nothing to say to them. They could call and text and email all they wanted, but I was done being drawn into conversations where they controlled the narrative and I ended up apologizing for their behavior. Instead, I spent the afternoon at Patricia Chen's office, reviewing the evidence Mrs. Patterson had provided and discussing the timeline for pursuing legal action if my children didn't return the stolen property within the 30-day deadline I'd given them. "Based on what you've told me and what your neighbor witnessed," Patricia said, "you have a strong case for both theft and potentially conspiracy charges. The coordinated timing, the use of deception to get you away from the house, the systematic removal of valuable items, it all suggests premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment decision." She explained the legal process that would unfold if I decided to file charges. First, I'd need to provide the police with a detailed inventory of the missing items, along with evidence of their value and proof that I hadn't given permission for them to be taken. Mrs. Patterson's witness testimony would be crucial in establishing the timeline and the coordinated nature of their actions. The police will investigate and determine whether there's sufficient evidence to pursue charges, Patricia continued. Given the value of the items involved and the apparent premeditation, this could be charged as felony theft. That means potential jail time, not just fines or restitution. The idea of my own children facing criminal charges was sobering, but so was the realization that they'd committed crimes against me while I was still trying to convince myself that our problems were just family disagreements that could be worked out through better communication. What if they return everything within the 30 days? I asked. Patricia considered this carefully. From a legal standpoint, returning stolen property doesn't undo the crime of taking it, but it could influence whether charges are filed and what kind of plea arrangements might be available. From a practical standpoint, it would show that they're taking your demands seriously and might be willing to rebuild the relationship on better terms. I left Patricia's office feeling clearer about my options and more confident about my decision to set firm boundaries around what behavior I was willing to tolerate. For too many years, I'd enabled my children's bad choices by protecting them from the natural consequences of their actions. If they were going to learn to treat me with respect, they needed to understand that disrespecting me came with real costs. The calls and messages continued for the rest of the week, becoming increasingly desperate and manipulative as it became clear that I wasn't going to respond to their initial attempts at damage control. Rebecca left a tearful voicemail about how this conflict was destroying her mental health and affecting her ability to function at work. Joshua sent a long email about childhood memories and how much he'd always looked up to me as a mother. Marcus tried appealing to my sense of family loyalty and Christian forgiveness. Even Natalie got involved, sending me a Facebook message about the importance of breaking cycles of family dysfunction and healing generational trauma through honest communication and mutual forgiveness. The irony of receiving advice about healthy family dynamics from someone who'd encouraged her boyfriend to participate in abandoning his mother wasn't lost on me. But the most telling communication came from Rebecca's Essential Oils upline mentor, a woman named Crystal who apparently felt qualified to mediate family disputes despite having never met me. Her email was a masterpiece of New Age manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. Dear Mrs. Freeman, it began, Rebecca has shared with me the painful situation your family is experiencing, and my heart goes out to all of you during this challenging time. As someone who has helped many families heal from similar conflicts, I wanted to reach out and offer some perspective that might help you find peace and resolution. The email went on to explain how holding on to anger and resentment was toxic to my own spiritual development, how forgiveness was a gift I gave myself rather than something I owed to others, and how family relationships required constant work and compromise from all parties involved. It was full of platitudes about love and healing and moving forward together, with no acknowledgement of the actual issues involved or the specific behaviors that had caused the conflict. I sense that you're operating from a place of hurt and fear, Crystal continued, which is completely understandable given the circumstances. But I also sense that you're a woman of wisdom and compassion who wants what's best for her children, even when they make mistakes. Perhaps this situation is an opportunity for your family to grow closer together by working through these challenges with open hearts and honest communication. The suggestion that I was operating from hurt and fear rather than rational assessment of unacceptable behavior was particularly galling. The implication that wanting my children to take responsibility for their actions was somehow preventing our family from growing closer together was exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled their bad behavior for so long. I forwarded Crystal's email to Patricia with a note asking whether third-party interference in family legal matters might constitute harassment. Patricia's response was swift and reassuring. This kind of manipulation is unfortunately common in family disputes, she wrote back. People often recruit allies to pressure the victim into accepting unacceptable behavior in the name of family harmony or spiritual growth. You're under no obligation to respond to these communications or to consider advice from people who don't understand the full situation. Stay focused on your boundaries and your timeline. As the first week of my 30-day deadline passed, a pattern emerged in the communications I was receiving. My children and their supporters were throwing everything they could think of at me, hoping something would stick and convince me to back down from my demands. They tried guilt, manipulation, spiritual bypassing, appeals to family loyalty, and emotional blackmail, but they never tried the one thing that might actually have worked: genuine accountability and sincere apologies. The second week brought a new strategy. Instead of trying to convince me that I was wrong to be upset, they started trying to negotiate partial compliance with my demands. Rebecca sent an email offering to return some of the disputed items if I would agree to family counseling to work through our communication issues. Joshua suggested a gradual return process where they would bring back 1 or 2 items each week while we rebuilt trust through regular family meetings. Marcus proposed what he called a restorative justice approach, where they would acknowledge Any misunderstandings about property ownership in exchange for my agreement to move forward together without involving legal authorities. Even Natalie suggested a healing circle where we could all share our feelings about the situation and co-create a new family dynamic based on mutual respect and understanding. All of these proposals had the same fundamental flaw: they treated theft as a negotiable offense that could be resolved through compromise and communication. They were asking me to accept partial restitution in exchange for dropping my demand for full accountability, essentially asking me to reward their criminal behavior by agreeing to family therapy. I didn't respond to any of these negotiation attempts. I'd been clear about my conditions, and I wasn't interested in bargaining with people who'd stolen from me about how much of my property they'd return in exchange for avoiding consequences for their actions. The third week brought escalation. Rebecca showed up at my workplace during my lunch break, apparently hoping to catch me in a public setting where I'd be less likely to make a scene. I was leaving the building to walk to a nearby restaurant when I saw her standing beside my car in the parking lot, holding a small box and wearing the kind of sad, hopeful expression that suggested she thought she could manipulate me through a surprise encounter. "Mom," she said as I approached, "please don't walk away. I brought some of the things you asked for, and I really need to talk to you." I stopped about 10 feet from my car, close enough to hear her but far enough away to avoid being cornered into a conversation I didn't want to have. "Rebecca, I told you my conditions. Return everything you took, along with written apologies acknowledging what you did. Until that happens, we have nothing to discuss." She held up the box like it was a peace offering. "I brought grandmother's lamp and the good china. That's worth at least $2,000. Can't we talk about the rest?" The fact that she knew the approximate value of what she'd stolen was telling, but so was her assumption that partial restitution should buy her a negotiation. "That's not how this works, Rebecca. You don't get to return some of what you stole and then bargain about the rest." Her expression shifted from hopeful to frustrated. "Mom, we can't return everything right away. Some of it's been sold or given away, and some of it's at Natalie's parents' house. This is all we can manage right now." The admission that they'd sold some of my property was stunning. They'd not only stolen from me, but they'd converted my belongings into cash for their own use. "What did you sell?" I asked. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. "Just some of the jewelry and a few other small things. We needed money for deposits and moving expenses. We didn't think you'd mind since you never wore those pieces anyway." The casual way she dismissed the value of items that had belonged to my mother and grandmother, the assumption that I wouldn't mind having my property sold without my permission because I didn't use it regularly, the complete absence of any understanding that selling someone else's belongings was theft regardless of the reason. It was all so perfectly Rebecca that I felt a familiar mixture of anger and sadness. "Put the box on the ground and step away from my car," I said quietly. "You've just admitted to selling my property without permission. That's not just theft, it's a felony." Her face went pale. "Mom, you're not going to call the police over some old jewelry. We're family. Family members don't steal from each other and then sell the stolen property to pay their bills," I replied. "You've made your choices, Rebecca. Now you get to live with the consequences." I waited until she'd put the box down and moved away from my car before I approached it. I put the box in my trunk without looking at its contents and drove away without another word, leaving her standing in the parking lot with whatever explanation she wanted to give herself about why her manipulation attempt had failed. That evening, I called Patricia and reported what Rebecca had told me about selling my jewelry. Patricia's response was immediate and decisive. "That changes everything," she said. "Theft is one thing, but selling stolen property is a separate crime that carries additional penalties. We need to document this conversation and add it to the evidence file. If you decide to pursue charges, this admission will significantly strengthen your case." I spent that evening going through the box Rebecca had returned, checking the items against my mental inventory of what was missing. The lamp was there, along with a set of china that had been my mother's, but both items showed signs of rough handling that suggested they hadn't been stored carefully. The lamp had a small chip in the base, and several of the china pieces had scratches that hadn't been there before. The carelessness with which they'd treated my family heirlooms was almost as hurtful as the theft itself. These weren't just valuable objects to me, they were connections to people I'd loved and lost, tangible reminders of my mother's hospitality and my grandmother's elegance. The fact that my children had treated them as disposable commodities to be sold or stored carelessly showed how little they understood or valued the things that mattered to me. I documented the damage with photographs and notes, adding them to the growing file of evidence I was accumulating. If this ended up in court, I wanted to be able to demonstrate not just the financial cost of their actions, but the emotional damage they'd caused by treating my most precious possessions as worthless objects they could dispose of at will. The fourth week brought desperation. Joshua showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, sitting on my front steps when I returned from grocery shopping. He looked thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of defeated posture that suggested he'd been sleeping poorly and eating irregularly. "Mom," he said as I got out of my car, "please let me explain what really happened. None of this was my idea, and I never wanted to hurt you." I considered driving away and coming back later, but something about his appearance made me hesitate. He looked genuinely distressed rather than manipulative, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to wait for me on these same steps when he came home from school. "You have 5 minutes," I said, not moving toward the house. "But I'm not changing my conditions based on anything you tell me." Joshua stood up slowly, like his bones ached. "The whole police station thing was Rebecca's idea. She said you were becoming too controlling about money and property, and that you'd never let us take anything if we asked directly. She convinced Marcus and Natalie that you were planning to kick us out anyway, so we might as well leave on our own terms." The revelation that they'd seen my reasonable expectations as controlling behavior was infuriating, but I let him continue without interrupting. "I didn't want to do it," he went on. "I thought it was cruel and unnecessary. But Rebecca said it would be better for everyone if we made a clean break instead of dragging out a bunch of arguments and guilt trips. She said you'd be happier without us anyway, and that taking some furniture was just compensation for all the work we'd done around the house." The rationalization was so absurd that I almost laughed. They'd lived in my house rent-free for years while I paid all the bills and did most of the housework, and somehow they'd convinced themselves that they deserved compensation for their minimal contributions to household maintenance. "And the jewelry you sold?" I asked. Joshua looked sick. "That was Marcus's idea. He said it was just sitting in a drawer doing nobody any good, and that you probably didn't even remember what you had. Rebecca didn't want to do it at first, but they needed money for security deposits and Marcus kept pushing. The image of Marcus pressuring my daughter to sell my mother's jewelry so he could afford to move into an apartment was nauseating. But what was even worse was the realization that Rebecca had gone along with it, that she'd valued Marcus's financial needs more than my emotional attachment to family heirlooms. "Where's the rest of my property?" I asked. Joshua's shoulders sagged. "Some of it's at our apartment, some of it's at Natalie's parents' house, and some of it was sold or given away. I don't think we can get all of it back, Mom. Some of the people who bought things are never going to sell them back to us." The admission that recovery of my stolen property might be impossible was the final confirmation I needed that legal action was the only way to get justice. They'd not only stolen from me, but they'd disposed of my belongings so carelessly that full restitution might not even be possible. "Your 5 minutes are up," I said, walking toward my front door. "If you want to make this right, you know what you need to do. Otherwise, you'll be hearing from my lawyer and the police." Joshua called after me as I unlocked my door. "Mom, I'm sorry. I know we messed up, but can't we work this out as a family? I miss you, and I hate that everything got so screwed up." I turned around one last time, looking at the son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, the child I'd protected and supported and believed in even when he made bad choices. "Joshua, you were right the first time. This wasn't your idea. But it became your choice when you went along with it instead of protecting me. That's the part one can't forgive." I went inside and locked the door behind me, leaving him sitting on my front steps with whatever explanations he wanted to give himself about how our relationship had deteriorated to this point. Through the window, I watched him sit there for another 10 minutes before finally getting up and walking away, his shoulders hunched against the weight of consequences he'd never expected to face. The 30-day deadline expired on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after I'd sent my final letters demanding the return of my property and written apologies for their behavior. I'd received partial restitution from Rebecca's parking lot ambush, but no apologies, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and no indication that they understood the seriousness of what they'd done. That morning, I called Patricia's office and scheduled an appointment to begin filing criminal charges. I also called the police station, the same one where my children had abandoned me 6 weeks earlier, and asked to speak with someone about filing a theft report. The officer who took my call was the same woman who delivered the news that my family wouldn't be coming back for me. When I explained who I was and what I wanted to report, her voice warmed with recognition and sympathy. "Mrs. Freeman," she said, "I remember you. I'm so sorry about what happened that day, and I'm not surprised to hear that there were other issues involved. Can you come in this afternoon to file a formal report?" I spent that afternoon at the police station, this time by choice rather than abandonment, providing a detailed account of what had been stolen and the evidence I'd gathered to support my claims. The officer was thorough and professional, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that helped me organize my thoughts and present the strongest possible case. Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've provided, she said when we'd finished, this looks like a clear case of felony theft with possible conspiracy charges. The coordination and premeditation you've described, along with the substantial value of the items involved, makes this a serious crime regardless of the family relationships involved. She explained that the investigation would take several weeks as they gathered additional evidence and interviewed witnesses. Mrs. Patterson would need to provide an official statement about what she'd observed, and they'd need to verify the ownership and value of the stolen items through receipts, insurance records, and appraisals. We'll also need to locate and interview your children, she continued. They'll have the opportunity to return the stolen property and cooperate with the investigation, which could influence how the charges are filed and prosecuted. I left the police station feeling like I'd finally taken control of a situation that had been controlling me for far too long. My children had made their choices, and now they would face the consequences of those choices through the legal system rather than through family negotiations that they could manipulate and control. That evening, Patricia called to let me know that she'd received a frantic voicemail from a lawyer representing Rebecca and Marcus. Apparently, word of the police investigation had reached them faster than expected, and they were now interested in discussing settlement options that might avoid criminal charges. It sounds like they're finally taking this seriously, Patricia said. Their lawyer wants to schedule a meeting to discuss full restitution and potential plea arrangements. Are you interested in hearing what they have to offer? I thought about it for several minutes, weighing the satisfaction of seeing them face trial against the possibility of recovering my property and getting the acknowledgement I demanded from the beginning. Schedule the meeting, I said finally. But make it clear that my conditions haven't changed. Full restitution, written apologies acknowledging what they did, and an agreement that they won't contest my will or attempt to contact me without permission. If they're not prepared to meet all of those conditions, then we'll see them in court. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across a conference table from my children for the first time since the morning they'd abandoned me at the police station. Rebecca looked older and more haggard than I remembered, with the kind of stress lines around her eyes that suggested she'd been sleeping poorly and worrying constantly. Joshua seemed smaller somehow, hunched in his chair like he was trying to disappear. Marcus sat beside Rebecca wearing a suit that looked like it had been borrowed for the occasion, his usual casual confidence replaced by nervous energy. Their lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 50s who specialized in criminal defense, spread papers across the table and began explaining their proposal. They were prepared to return all remaining stolen property, pay restitution for items that had been sold or damaged, and provide written statements acknowledging their actions. In exchange, they wanted me to agree not to pursue criminal charges and to consider restoring them to my will. My clients recognize that they made serious errors in judgment, the lawyer said carefully, and they're prepared to make full restitution for any harm caused by their actions. They're hoping that we can resolve this matter within the family rather than through the criminal justice system. I listened to the entire proposal without speaking, watching my children's faces as their lawyer outlined what they were willing to do to avoid prosecution. They looked scared and ashamed, which was more accountability than I'd seen from them in years. But they also looked resentful, like they were being forced to apologize for behavior they still didn't think was wrong. When the lawyer finished, I turned to Patricia. What's the monetary value of what they're offering? Patricia consulted her notes. Based on the inventory you provided and the current market value of comparable items, full restitution would be approximately $12,000. That includes the items they've already returned, the cash value of sold items, and compensation for damage to recovered property. I looked across the table at my children, these adults I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who were now offering to pay me $12,000 to avoid facing the consequences of stealing from me. The money would be useful, but it wasn't what I really wanted from them. I want to hear the apologies first, I said. Before we discuss anything else, I want each of you to explain what you did wrong and why you did it. The silence that followed was uncomfortable and revealing. Rebecca looked at her lawyer like she was hoping he'd object to my request. Joshua stared at the table like he was trying to find the right words. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again when Rebecca shot him a warning look. Finally, Rebecca cleared her throat and began speaking in the flat, rehearsed tone of someone reciting a prepared statement. Mom, I'm sorry for taking your property without permission and for any pain our actions may have caused you. We never intended to hurt you, and we regret that our behavior has damaged our family relationships. The non-apology was so obviously scripted and insincere that I felt angry all over again. She wasn't acknowledging what she'd done wrong or taking responsibility for her choices. She was performing remorse to avoid consequences, which was exactly what she'd been doing our entire relationship. That's not an apology, I said quietly. That's a legal statement designed to minimize your liability while appearing to take responsibility. I want you to tell me, in your own words, what you did to me and why it was wrong. Rebecca's mask slipped, and for a moment I saw the fury she was trying to hide. Fine. We took some furniture and household items when we moved out because we thought we had a right to them after living in your house for so long. We didn't ask permission because we knew you'd probably say no, and we thought it was easier to just take what we needed and deal with the consequences later. We were wrong to do it without asking, and we're sorry it turned into such a big deal. The resentment was obvious, and so was her continued refusal to acknowledge the police station abandonment or the deliberate deception involved in their theft. She was still framing it as a property dispute that had gotten out of hand rather than a coordinated betrayal that had revealed who they really were. What about the police station? I asked. Rebecca looked at her lawyer again, but he just nodded. For her to continue. That was wrong too. We thought it would be easier if we made a clean break instead of having a big confrontation, but we should have been honest with you about our plans to move out. Easier for whom, I wanted to ask, but I could see that pushing for more accountability would just result in more lawyer-approved non-apologies that revealed nothing about their actual understanding of what they'd done wrong. I turned to Joshua. What's your apology? Joshua looked genuinely distressed, but his words were just as inadequate as his sister's. Mom, I'm sorry I went along with Rebecca's plan instead of standing up for you. I knew it was wrong to leave you at the police station, and I knew taking your stuff without asking was stealing. I was too much of a coward to say no, and I'm sorry for hurting you. At least Joshua acknowledged that he'd known their actions were wrong, which was more honesty than I'd gotten from Rebecca. But it was still fundamentally an excuse rather than an apology. He was sorry for being a coward, not sorry for choosing to participate in hurting me. Marcus didn't wait for me to ask for his apology. Mrs. Freeman, I know I had no right to take anything from your house or to encourage Rebecca to sell your jewelry. I was thinking about our immediate needs instead of considering your feelings, and that was selfish and wrong. I'm sorry for my part in all of this. His apology was more direct than the others, but it was also the least meaningful since our relationship had never included love or trust to begin with. He was apologizing for practical reasons, not because he felt genuine remorse for betraying someone who'd cared about him. I sat back in my chair and looked at the three people who'd orchestrated my abandonment and theft, who were now offering me money and rehearsed apologies in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. They looked sorry, but they looked sorry for getting caught rather than sorry for what they'd done. They wanted me to accept their restitution and move on as if nothing had happened, as if family relationships could be repaired through financial transactions and legal settlements. Patricia, I said without taking my eyes off my children, what would happen if I rejected their offer and pursued criminal charges? She consulted her notes again. Based on the evidence and their lawyer's acknowledgement of the facts, they'd likely be charged with felony theft and possibly conspiracy. With no prior criminal records, they'd probably avoid jail time through plea bargains, but they'd have criminal records and would be required to pay restitution anyway. The process would take several months and would be emotionally difficult for everyone involved. I thought about that for several minutes while everyone else waited in uncomfortable silence. My children were offering me everything I'd originally demanded, plus money to compensate for items that couldn't be returned. If I accepted their proposal, I'd recover most of what I'd lost and they'd avoid the lasting consequences of criminal records. But I'd also be enabling their behavior one final time, showing them that they could steal from me and abandon me as long as they were willing to pay for the privilege after they got caught. I'd be teaching them that family relationships were transactional, that love and loyalty could be purchased through restitution payments and lawyer-approved apologies. I need time to consider your proposal, I said finally. I'll give you my answer within 48 hours. The relief on their faces was obvious, as if my willingness to consider their offer was already a victory. They probably expected me to accept, to choose family harmony over accountability, to prioritize their comfort over my own sense of justice. They were about to learn that they'd underestimated me one final time. That evening, I called Patricia and told her my decision. I'm rejecting their offer, I said. They can keep their money and their fake apologies. I want them prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Patricia wasn't surprised. I thought you might choose that route. Their apologies were clearly insincere, and accepting their settlement would send the message that stealing from you is acceptable as long as they're willing to pay you back when they get caught. The next morning, I called their lawyer and informed him that I was rejecting the settlement offer and proceeding with criminal charges. His disappointment was obvious, but so was his acceptance that his clients had brought this outcome on themselves through their inadequate response to my reasonable demands. That afternoon, Patricia called to let me know that Rebecca, Joshua, and Marcus had all been formally charged with felony theft and conspiracy. Arrest warrants had been issued, and they'd be required to turn themselves in within 24 hours. Or face additional charges for failure to appear. How do you feel? Patricia asked. I thought about it carefully before answering. I feel like I finally stopped being a victim and started being someone who refuses to tolerate unacceptable behavior. They made their choices, and now they get to live with the consequences. For the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I received the call I'd been expecting but dreading. Patricia's voice was professional but warm when she told me that Rebecca had accepted a plea bargain that included 2 years of probation, community service, and full restitution. Joshua had received a similar deal, while Marcus faced slightly harsher terms due to his role in selling my jewelry. They'll all have criminal records, Patricia explained, but they'll avoid jail time if they comply with the terms of their probation. The restitution payments will be made through the court system, so you'll receive compensation for everything that was stolen or damaged. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the legal process was finally ending, and sadness that it had come to this. My children were now convicted criminals because they'd chosen to steal from me rather than treat me with basic respect and consideration. But I didn't regret my decision to pursue charges. They'd needed to learn that actions have consequences, and that family relationships don't exempt anyone from basic moral and legal obligations. If I'd accepted their inadequate apologies and hollow promises, they would have learned that they could betray me as long as they were willing to perform remorse afterward. The house on Maple Street had become my sanctuary again, quiet and peaceful and organized according to my preferences. I'd used some of the restitution money to redecorate, replacing furniture and belongings that held painful memories with new items that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. I'd also started volunteering at the women's shelter. That would inherit my house someday, helping other women who were rebuilding their lives after leaving situations where they'd been taken advantage of and undervalued. It was meaningful work that reminded me daily why I'd chosen to redirect my legacy toward people who understood the value of second chances and safe spaces. The dating had evolved into a relationship with a man named Robert, a retired teacher, whose own adult children lived independent lives while maintaining respectful, loving relationships with their father. Robert understood boundaries and appreciated kindness without taking it for granted. He brought flowers when he visited, helped with household projects when I asked, and never assumed that my generosity obligated me to meet his needs at my own expense. We'd talked about my decision to disinherit my children, and Robert had shared his own experiences with adult children who'd struggled to launch successfully. The hardest part of parenting, he'd said, is knowing when to stop helping and start requiring them to help themselves. You can't love someone into being a better person, but you can stop enabling them to be worse. The wisdom in his words had helped me understand that my choice hadn't been about punishment or revenge. It had been about refusing to fund behavior that was destructive to everyone involved, including my children themselves. By removing the safety net of my inheritance, I was forcing them to develop the independence and responsibility they should have learned years earlier. Rebecca had tried to contact me several times during her probation period, always through intermediaries who delivered messages about how much she'd learned from this experience and how sorry she was for everything that had happened. But her messages never included specific acknowledgments of what she'd done wrong or concrete changes she was making in her life. They were always variations on the theme that she'd grown as a person and hoped we could rebuild our relationship. Joshua's attempts at contact were more direct but equally unsatisfying. He'd sent birthday cards and holiday cards with handwritten notes about missing our family traditions and hoping we could find a way to heal together. But he never addressed the fundamental issues that had led to our estrangement, instead treating the whole situation like a misunderstanding that could be resolved through persistence and good intentions. Marcus, surprisingly, had been the most honest in his single attempt to contact me. He'd sent a straightforward letter acknowledging that he'd manipulated Rebecca and Joshua into participating in something he'd known was wrong, and that he took full responsibility for his role in destroying their relationship with me. He didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest that we should try to rebuild anything. He simply acknowledged his guilt and expressed genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. I'd appreciated his honesty, even as I recognized that it came too late to change anything. The damage had been done, and the trust had been broken beyond repair. Marcus's belated accountability was meaningful, but it didn't erase the months of manipulation and theft that had preceded it. The most difficult part of the whole experience had been accepting that the children I'd raised and loved were gone, replaced by adults who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The Rebecca who'd helped me plant flowers and the Joshua who'd fallen asleep in my arms during bedtime stories had evolved into people who could abandon me at a police station without apparent remorse. But I'd also learned that grieving the loss of who my children had been didn't mean I had to accept mistreatment from who they'd become. I could love the memories of raising them while protecting myself from the reality of their current behavior. I could honor the mother I'd been while refusing to continue enabling the adults they'd chosen to become. The charity work had introduced me to women who'd made similar difficult choices about toxic family relationships. I'd met mothers who'd had to distance themselves from adult children struggling with addiction, grandmothers who'd been forced to seek legal protection from grandchildren who'd threatened them for money, and wives who'd learned to prioritize their own safety over family loyalty. These women had taught me that choosing yourself over family dysfunction wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for survival, and often it was the most loving thing you could do for everyone involved. By refusing to enable destructive behavior, you force people to face the consequences of their choices and potentially learn from them. 1 year after the police station abandonment, I received a letter from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson had written to tell me that she'd seen Rebecca and Marcus moving out of their apartment complex, apparently unable to afford the rent after Marcus lost another job. Joshua and Natalie had broken up, she'd heard through neighborhood gossip, and Joshua was living in a studio apartment across town while working at a grocery store. I thought you might want to know that they're all struggling, Mrs. Patterson wrote, but they're also all working and supporting themselves for the first time in years. Maybe losing your support was what they needed to finally grow up. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children were finally developing independence and work ethic because I'd stopped providing them with alternatives. By removing my financial support and emotional enabling, I'd forced them to discover capabilities they'd always possessed but never needed to use. I felt a complicated mixture of sadness and satisfaction reading about their struggles. Sadness because I'd wanted them to succeed with my help rather than despite my absence, and satisfaction because they were proving they could survive and even thrive when they were required to take responsibility for themselves. 2 years after changing my will, I received notification that all the restitution payments had been completed. My children had successfully fulfilled the financial terms of their probation, which meant they'd managed to earn and save enough money to compensate me for everything they'd stolen. The court system had accomplished what years of my encouragement and support had failed to achieve. It had motivated them to work consistently and manage money responsibly. The final payment came with a brief note from the court clerk indicating that all 3 defendants had complied fully with their probation terms and would have their cases closed successfully. Reading that notification, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. They'd faced real consequences for their actions and had risen to meet the challenge of accountability. I'd kept every piece of documentation from the entire ordeal, not because I enjoyed reliving the betrayal, but because I wanted to remember the lessons I'd learned about boundaries, consequences, and self-respect. The thick folder of legal papers, police reports, and court documents represented my transformation. From someone who accepted unacceptable behavior to someone who demanded better treatment. Patricia had become more than my lawyer during this process. She'd become a friend who understood the courage required to prioritize your own well-being over family dysfunction. She'd helped me understand that protecting yourself from people who hurt you isn't cruel or vindictive. It's necessary for survival and often the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. You gave them the greatest gift possible, Patricia had told me during our final meeting. You taught them that their actions have consequences, and that they're capable of taking responsibility for their choices. They may not appreciate that lesson now, but someday they might understand that you helped them become better people by refusing to enable their worst behaviors. 3 years later, I was living the life I'd never imagined possible when I was supporting 4 adults who treated my generosity as their entitlement. My house was peaceful and organized, my finances were stable and growing, and my relationships were built on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Robert and I had moved in together, combining our households and our lives in a partnership that felt balanced and sustainable. He contributed equally to our shared expenses, appreciated my cooking without expecting it, and supported my charity work without trying to control or direct it. We were building something together rather than one person supporting the others. Lifestyle choices. The inheritance money that would have gone to my children was instead funding scholarships for single mothers, supporting housing programs for domestic violence survivors, and contributing to literacy initiatives that helped adults develop the skills they needed for independence. Every dollar was going to people who understood its value and used it to build better lives for themselves and their families. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened if my children had chosen accountability over deflection, respect over entitlement, independence over dependence. But I'd learned not to waste emotional energy on alternative histories that could never be changed. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine, and both sets of decisions had led to consequences that reflected our priorities and values. The woman who'd once driven her daughter to a police station believing she was helping with an insurance claim was gone, replaced by someone who understood the difference between supporting people you love and enabling people who take advantage of You. The mother who'd once funded adult children's lifestyle choices while apologizing for her own needs had evolved into someone who prioritized her own well-being without guilt or shame. I still loved the children I'd raised, but I'd learned to love myself more than I loved their approval. I discovered that you can't help people who don't want to be helped, but you can stop letting their choices control your life. I'd realized that the most loving thing you can sometimes do for someone is refuse to participate in their dysfunction. The police station where my children had abandoned me had become a symbol of liberation rather than betrayal. They'd thought they were punishing me by walking away, but they'd actually freed me to become someone who demanded better treatment and got it. They'd tried to teach me a lesson about what happened when I didn't meet their expectations, but they'd ended up learning about what happened when they didn't meet mine. Every morning when I woke up in my peaceful house, every evening when I came home to a space organized according to my preferences, every time I made financial decisions based on my own priorities rather than other people's demands, I remembered that some of the best things in life come from having the courage to let go of people who don't appreciate what you offer. My children had left me at a police station, but I'd left them with something far more valuable, a lawyer who'd helped me reclaim my life, my dignity, and my future. And in the end, that trade had been the best deal I'd ever made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.